All right. Well, welcome everybody to today's Community of Voices. We're going to be diving into what it means to go solar at your home and learn from the experiences of someone who's done it personally, someone who's done installations and has been a rep for solar, and somebody who has some pretty deep knowledge in the energy space. We're joined today by John, Steph, and Al. And if we could go ahead and we'll just kind of jump on into it. And yeah, so Steph, why don't you go ahead, give us a quick introduction, and then you can kick things off.
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Steph McCurdy. I currently work for Wolfram Research as the lead of our Wolfram Blockchain Labs. This is a endeavor that's still piggybacking off of a long-term interest in energy and in complex systems. Um, and so let me touch a little bit about why I should be able to speak a little bit on the energy grid, on decentralization, and on kind of our general energy blindness. So in 2017, I fell down quite a big rabbit hole trying to understand why solar wasn't more popular in at least the United States. It seemed to me that the prices of solar panels were dramatically reducing, efficiency was steadily increasing, maybe not by drastic terms, but by enough to rationalize economic costs that I would have expected to see more solar in more places. Um, and so it led me to want to really understand who was producing solar panels, why was it economically a viable choice, what were some of the large limitations at a kind of societal level, and who was doing it best, what kind of companies. Um, it was pretty quick for me to find that Tesla was going to be doing something a little bit different in the solar realm. And so I needed to learn more. And I obviously wanted to learn a little bit more from Elon Musk directly. Um, didn't actually meet him while working for Tesla, but joined the company in 2017 as an energy advisor. And this role is, I wasn't advising the whole company on how the energy strategy would go. This was the title of somebody who sold and educated the customers about our energy products. And if you're not familiar, Tesla's mission statement is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. It used to be accelerate the world's transition to sustainable transport, but the mission kind of evolved and it was bigger than just transportation. It was about energy in general. And that's how Elon Musk lays out his three-part master plan, which I would encourage anyone to take a look at. It's very interesting on how one scales from how one thinks about solar energy as a larger infrastructure project in the United States and in the world. Okay, so for a year and a half, I was trying to understand where the economics were, trying to understand what the limitations were at the grid scale, and um, try to understand what were actual individual homeowners' decision making on why they should or should not go solar. One book that I would highly recommend for anyone trying to get the big picture grasp of what's going on with solar is a book called The Grid by Gretchen Bach. Gretchen Bach is a cultural anthropologist that wanted to understand the interrelated dynamics of the grid infrastructure. For those that don't know, the United States is made up of three large electrical grids that kind of operate on their own. Texas is one, the eastern and northeast is another, and then the west has another. And these kind of cross boundaries in some places too, across Canada, across Mexico. Um, so the grid is this kind of fragile thing that's been built and emerged over hundreds of years. And the way that the grid works is not something that I'm going to try and cover here, but it's a delicate balance of ensuring that the level of current that's being supplied at variable rates at different points of time of day based on the various input fuel sources such as nuclear, natural gas, oil, coal, solar, wind, hydrothermal, etc., all interplay. And what the book does, the grid, really gives you a good understanding of how hard it is to balance an old infrastructure with new and variable uh, inputs like solar, like wind. And so that's one of the large limitations here is that when you think about it, I'm staring at some solar panels on a neighbor's house across the way here. When a cloud, this is a very small example, but every sol, not, I won't say every, in order for a typical household to interact with the grid, their solar system needs to be interconnected to that grid so that it can pull when the solar panels are not producing at night, but also put back onto the system. And they essentially reverse meter and get time credits back. But they need to have that interconnection. And the question is, what happens when you're at a level balance on the grid and that's with the solar system putting out what it's generating, and then a big cloud comes over top and takes that service right off, right in an instance. What what the grid operators have to do is ensure that there's a balanced load on the entire system, because if not, you could have brownouts, you could have blackouts, or you could fry the wires if you do it in an unbalanced way. And so from a very large perspective, there are so many interacting forces that at times uh, solar companies are limited on how much solar they can install. Consumers are limited on how much they can, how large of a system they can go based on their previous 12 months. I think John might talk about this, and same with Al. Um, so let me just wrap up and say I'm very acutely aware of the large complex system that is our electrical grid that is often outdated and requires some mitigation of the volatility that a potential cloud or variable source such as solar and wind need. And that's the indication towards Tesla's master plan, which is essentially scale up battery production so that one can ensure that the variable fuel sources like solar and wind have some place to outlet when they're overproducing and where to pull from when they're underproducing. And I think this changes kind of the overall structure of our electrical grid when you have batteries on wheels, large batteries on wheels, and when the whole economy kind of moves in a electric vehicle direction. So I'll stop there. I would love to pass it on to I believe Al, who's serviced one of the from a solar installation company, and taught himself how to do a lot of this himself. So Al, if you don't mind, I'll pass it over to you if that makes sense.
No, that is awesome. Thank you, Steph. That's I really love the way you framed the whole thing and the fragility and how important batteries are. I guess the next thing is like how quick we can pump that energy from the batteries. I know that's sometimes not as quick as like a generator, fortunately. But that's another topic, I guess. Okay, so give me 2 seconds here. All right. Almost there. I'm going to share my screen. Let's show you step by step here. Share screen. Boom. You see my screen? Do you see a map? Let's see. Okay.
Yep, looks good.
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, that's so my name is Al Cabal. I have my background is architecture, but I ventured into entrepreneurship. And then within my entrepreneurship time, that it started, 2008, 9, I started looking into renewable energy. And then I started, consulting utility scale solar, which is it's kind of crazy. I wish we had more time so I could share the whole story, but all of a sudden I was like a solar contractor doing huge projects, and it happened very quickly. And so I had to learn quickly. And then during that whole time, there was a time where I did some independent contracting for Sunrun. So I did some sales for them. And that's what you see on the map. So because we're gonna talk more about residential, I'm gonna talk more about residential. So that, from my installation and solar entrepreneur experience and other entrepreneurship, then having that experience with the largest solar provider at that time, I think they're like head to head with Tesla at the moment. I learned a lot more from a huge company and high volume residential. And so yeah, that gave me another experience, very quick experience as well. And then I started, I started installing on my own again, plus other things that I do. So what you see on the map is kind of like the area that I service with Sunrun. We were not limited to local, but so I also did some Northeast and some Illinois, but mostly in the Bay Area. And that's what you see in the middle. That's the Bay Area. A lot more on the east side of the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where it's sunnier, of course. And then I zoom in, and then you could see some of these locations. So that's about 300 systems that I consulted with, customers, from start to finish on a solar project. And then on my own, I've done about 30, 40, but they're not on this map yet. Upcoming. So with all that said, my takeaway in all this experience was like solar can be very easy, actually. Very, very easy. And that's why I felt confident in just starting my own little company. And my initial business plan was like, do it yourself with help. So that's what I'm gonna show you how to do it yourself. Well, I'm not gonna have time to show you everything, but I'm just gonna give you like some generals, and then I can share more pictures if we have time. So let's start with like, how do you go solar? How do you make the decision? So I created like a little like a tree branch. I'm sorry, a decision tree. Okay, do you see it? It says over here, it says going solar, right? So you're thinking about going solar. You've already done all the math. You've looked into everything, kind of like what John is going to share later. And then you're like, yeah, I want to go solar. Okay. Do you have a home? Is it a residential thing or is it a business? That's a big question there. If it's residential, okay, you can do it yourself or do it yourself with help. If it's commercial, probably better if you hire a contractor and or a professional engineer. All right. So, yeah, okay. So you want to do it yourself? Okay, great. What type of roof do you have? And also, once you start thinking about the roof, you should start thinking about like what kind of solar panels you want to use, because there's many types. So that's when a lot of decisions start happening. Look at that tree, how it's branching out, right? And so then here's a bunch of types of roofs. You got the very common in the United States, the composition shingle. Then you have one that is more common in the north, the high seam metal roof. And then there's other types of solar panels, the peel and stick. That's a new thing where you can just kind of like peel the solar panel and just like glue it. Love that. Not very common yet. Then there's tile roofs. There's many types of tile roofs. The two most common are the curvy, the S tile or Spanish tile. And then there's the flat tile. And those are usually concrete or cement fiber, and the worst for solar, clay. Okay. Then there's a bunch of other metal roofs. I'm not going to go into that, but there's many types of metal. And then there's many types of flat roofs too. And then there's slate, shake, and then more recently solar tiles. Steph mentioned Tesla. They're known for their solar tiles, one of the most common, famous products out there. So if you want to get an idea of what these things look like, I'm sorry, that might be a little too small, but up here, the shingle, you could see how they look like. We can go into it more, but I wanted to put more attention on the shingles because that's more common, right? And we can zoom in later if you want to see more, if you have questions. And then I wanted to also point out to this one in the middle, the flat, this flat roof, this type is called rolled comp. And then also, these peel and stick, like I mentioned, they're really cool. Look how they're just kind of glued to the roof. So those are the types of roofs. So what do you have? All right. If you have the upper three, you could do it yourself. Very easy. If you have tile or other metal, you could do it yourself too, but you might need some help, especially with tile or clay tile, things like that. And of course with metal. White tile, because it's very clunky, very difficult to work with. You have to lift the tile, they're heavy. You can break them. It's a mess. And then the other metal, the waterproofing needs to be very well done. Similar with the flat roofs. But that's even more complex when it comes to making a decision. So that's why I'm putting a whole category there. Like, is it roll comp or is it any other, right? And if you have slate or shake roof, forget it. Don't even try it. So either, re-roof or consider ground mounting. And then solar tiles, I'm not even talking about that yet. Cool. So, all right. So then we keep going. There's a lot of work going on here, right? You're doing a lot of research. Here comes some other decisions, right? So here comes the roll comp or any other roof, for example. Let's say you have a flat roof. Those are kind of common with modern homes, and especially with some of the new things that I'm doing, like green roofs. That's another type of flat roof, like a green roof. So let's say you have a rolled comp. Great, that's going on the upper direction of do it yourself, very easy. But if you have some other type of flat roofs, you might want to re-roof or do ground mount. I didn't touch too much on the other types that you might be able to do yourself, but we can cover that later. So let's say you're here with the re-roof. You're one of these that you cannot do, right? So you kind of go back, or if you're right here, you kind of you go backwards, and then it's like, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to re-roof or am I going to ground mount? Right? Well, if you're going to re-roof, just hire a roofer and then do one of these up here, and then boop, you're up here, back up in do it yourself or do it yourself with help. But if you want to consider ground mount, again, you're back to the professional engineer or contractor. Why? Because you need a professional engineer to calculate your footings. And you probably want a contractor to, pour concrete and all that. I mean, there's some informal ways of doing ground mount, but I'm not maybe when we talk more about solar on network states, then we can talk about some other informal ways of doing ground mount, but I'm talking about the professional or, ways you can pull permit with. Cool. So anyway, so let's say, okay, we re-roofed or whatever. We're back in the do-it-yourself and do-it-yourself with help categories up here. Great. All right, here comes electricity. Is it, so now, okay, now we thought about roofs, and we were thinking a little bit about gravity too. Like, I don't want to fall down, right? But now instead of gravity, now we got to talk about electricity. That's a little scary as well. The first question, main panel. So usually the only way to know this, you have to start doing some electrical calculations. Nothing too difficult that you cannot search on YouTube. But basically, there's a formula to know if you need to upgrade your main panel or not. But also, like if it's a really old main panel or sub panel, you might have to replace it. And also, if you have room or not. If you don't have room, you might have to install a new sub panel. So those are kind of like the questions that appear when you start thinking about electricity and looking at your, whatever you have electric wise on your home, right? So do you have to do any of that? No. Great. You could do it yourself. Sorry, a little fast forward there. Great, you can do it yourself. No. Okay, you might be able to pull it off, do it yourself with some help. That's what I started doing. I started hiring electricians until I learned myself from them. So that's what I call with help. Hire someone who knows a little bit more, or get some help from someone. So that's what I started doing, and then they started helping me like put new panels, things like that. But like you may also just hire an electrician, right, or a contractor if you have to replace all that, right? So actually, there's a yes that could go here too and do yourself with help. But I did it a little more like formal, like, okay, just hire a certified electrician to do it for you. So I'm down here, right? But let's say you don't have to do any of that. Great. That means, sorry, I don't have pictures of that. But let's say you have a main panel, and there's like you see there's rooms for breakers. Boom, easy. Or let's say you have a sub panel, which is usually connected to the main panel, and then there's room for breakers. Great, easy. Sometimes it doesn't seem like you have room for breakers, but then you kind of like move them around, or you put like mixed breakers, and then it works too. So then it gets a little more complicated, right? The less you do, the more you can do it yourself. Then here comes some newer interesting things like, okay, great, we're still in the do-it-yourself category. Does your local jurisdiction, your county, your city, do they have a standardized configurations permit submittal option? What does that mean? It's like you go on the website, you're going to pull a permit, and it's already like pre-made form, and then you just enter like the electric values that I mentioned. Like you have to like learn a little bit about electric calculations. And then, but a lot of it comes from the actual solar equipment. And then you just enter all those values. You do have to enter some structural values too that I'm going to share shortly if we have time. And then you enter all the structural values as well to make sure the structures are sound to support solar. So if they do have all that, great. Yes, do it yourself. You can keep going. Zero cost so far. But if they don't have that standardized configurations permits submittal, and a lot of jurisdictions don't have that yet. I know there's programs all over the country to, incentivize solar, so they're trying to do that. But many don't have it yet, or they're scared to do it that way, right? So okay, great. So just hire a designer, someone who's going to do the plans for you, or once again, hire a contractor. They can do it all. But at this point, you might want to save money, and it's kind of like a do-it-yourself with help option. You hire a designer, and it goes from $500 to $2,000 depending on the complexity, and they'll do like a permit set of plans. And then you submit it. You can submit it as an owner builder. You don't need a contractor in residential. And then you get the tools. You only need like 3 or 4 tools, and then you might do some like makeshift devices if you want to install solar by yourself. I can share some of that. If you want to install solar by yourself alone, you can as well. And then you put like a makeshift, like a solar panel lift. It took me like, an hour to build with wood. I just carry the thing, put it on a little platform, and then I go up to the roof, and then I lift it from the top. Panels only weigh like 40, 50 pounds each. So yeah, so that's it. So get your tools and go to the roof, get it installed. So that's how you do it yourself. I can share some of the pictures. I think we're on time, right? 10 minutes already or more?
Yeah, I think we're right about that 10-minute mark. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I can share some of these things and more pictures that I have. In the meantime, I'll pass it on to John, who my understanding is that went on the contractor route, which is perfectly understandable. Most of my customers they didn't want to do anything.
Yes, very much so. I said in the chat, I wish VDAO had existed a year and a half ago, or that I had met you and Steph, Al, to so I wouldn't have even considered doing the project myself, but just from what you guys described, there's a lot that I learned. So even though I've been through the process, installed solar, I learned a bunch of things. And so I think, Steph, your context on like how these things, work in the bigger picture, is helpful to me in understanding partly why what I'll share here, some of these models were complex and confusing to me. But it is good to see that people have and can do it themselves. So I actually wanted to install solar many years ago. So this is the house my wife and I and our 4 kids lived in for 15 years. Couple problems. One, it's in a historic district, so they have restrictions on what you can do to the outside of your house. 2 is a 135-year-old house. And then 3, you can see the shape of the roof. So what I've learned is that a lot of communities have restrictions based on what is visible from the street. So, and you can't see in this picture, but the angle of the roof, we were next to a corner, so you could very much see the roof from the street. Obviously, the turret on the right wouldn't have been a good surface anyway, but we would have been able to get some panels. I get the idea of historic districts, but we need to save the planet. So if we preserve districts but don't save the planet, that's not so great. But I was able to successfully install a system with a contractor, with a provider I'll talk about. So not too far from where we live, we basically rebuilt a house with essentially mostly flat roofs. I didn't even know there were that many different kinds of roof. I was familiar with shingle, and they called this one, you can see here in the middle. So the middle here is before the panels were put on. These are the sort of the supports. So the contractor called it a rubber roof in this main part, and then there's some shingles in the back. In fact, you can see our neighbors, their solar panels, which they subsequently expanded, and quite a few people in our neighborhood have solar. So these are some shots from me climbing up on the roof and taking pictures once they were installed. So we have 50 panels. Interestingly, the house next to us got solar more recently, smaller house, and they have 56 panels. So now I've got some panel envy. I was amazed how many they were able to squeeze in. So I guess that gets to the design, because they had some vertical, some horizontal. So I think one of the first things that you come to as a consumer is, what the local zoning will allow in terms of solar panels, probably also in terms of like installation and what aspects need to be done by a licensed, electrician, et cetera. In my case in New Jersey, the local public utility was very involved. I believe they had to approve the size of our system, and I think that gets to your load and looking at neighborhoods and how many houses have solar, what the demand is, et cetera. But I did a little research. So it's a common challenge or question in different communities in terms of what's allowed. I wasn't familiar with solar shingles, but I learned about that. And then there's this concept of community solar where instead of installing on your property, you can pay for an installation somewhere else or contribute to an installation somewhere else, and you're getting the credits. And the process that I went through, so I spent probably 3 months trying to find a provider. So I should have done more research. I should have looked for a book. I didn't realize how complex it would be. So I just started calling different providers, and through that process, learning about the different models and so clearly some providers were pushing, certain approaches, like saying, there's no money down, there's no cost. And that ended up being the lease model. So basically either you own the system and the equipment or somebody else does. The owner of the equipment gets any and all tax credits, which is a big, consideration. But whether you purchase the system outright or you finance it, you're the owner of the system, and so you get all those credits. So obviously, if you're buying it outright, it's a big outlay, but you're getting all the credits. The U.S. federal tax credit is 30% of the system cost, and I can say when we did our taxes this year, it just sent a form to our accountant and added it in, and we got the 30% credit, which was great. And it was all claimable in the first year. So even though, so we installed it in October, I did end up financing it, but we got the credit, the federal credit all up front. Then there are state programs and credits, and talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So basically, it's the fastest way to break even on the cost of the system. With financing, there's various options. So I initially went with the provider that we chose, Freedom Solar, their financing company. Then I switched it to a home equity loan later, which was lower interest rate. Also loans for financing and incentive in addition to the credits and other incentives. So basically, you got to look at a lot of different factors in the financing cost versus the savings in electricity and the credits, and think about how long do you want it to take to break even. And so with the lease option, you're basically, my understanding is you're paying a monthly fee to a company. They install, they maintain the equipment, and you have a contract. So then obviously that monthly payment cuts into the energy savings you get, and you get none of the tax credits. And then something I hadn't thought about, if you move, what happens, then with the lease. So apparently you need to either buy the equipment, move the system, which I can't imagine might not fit on the new place, et cetera, or try to get the new owner to take on the lease, which complicate the sale of a house. So my number one recommendation is to do research, try to find a consultant, someone who knows what they're doing, has been through it. I would, in retrospect, gladly have paid someone to, either walk me through the process, help me find a provider, or work with me on doing different aspects. So I would say, definitely get recommendations from people who have had a system, for a few years. As we said in the chat, there's also the challenge of the potential for leaks. So we had our system installed, and the roof was 6 months old when we installed it. It had no leaks, no problems. Immediately after it was installed, we had a leak coming through into one of the bedrooms. They initially said, "Oh, that wasn't us. All of our seals, everything is good." They even tried to say that it was the air conditioning duct condensation, which it was water pouring through. I knew that wasn't the case, but they have been good about coming back out, patching it. It actually came twice, repairing it. So now I'm confident that it's been, at least that one has been taken care of. So I think, again, someone you trust and who's going to stand by what they install. In last week's VDAO session, one of the experts said, and I'm sure it varies a lot, by geographic area, but maybe $2.50 a kilowatt hour. Mine, I think, was about $4. Although there was an aspect that I didn't realize until recently on the DC to AC conversion. So everything the provider quoted me and showed in the plan was kilowatt hours in terms of DC when the electricity is produced, but it has to be converted to AC, and that's a lower amount. So maybe one of the experts can explain that. I haven't factored that in, so it might have actually cost me even more. So I think the key is to invest the time in really understanding all these different aspects of which, obviously which model you choose. Think about your overall financial planning, not just now, but in the future. But so there's the size of the system, the number of panels that obviously determines how much electricity is going to be produced, related to, how much you need. So the projection that the provider did for us was that this system, the 20,000 kilowatts for a year, would produce 48% of our need. So far, it's looking like it'll be a lot more. So good in the sense that we're getting more of our electricity from the sun, but that completely changed the numbers in the financial consideration and basically the amount of time that it takes to pay for itself. Another key aspect of that is the electricity usage, how you get that projection of how much electricity you need. I didn't realize till later they'd asked me, and again, this was a new resident, so I didn't have 12 months of bills, but they basically took the highest month of the year, highest electricity cost, and assumed that's what we would be using throughout the year, which is not the case at all. The other factor in their model was the assumption of how much the public utility increases the electricity rate each year. I would say definitely validate that, because I think the one that they put in our model looks like wasn't necessarily accurate. And then definitely factor in the amount and duration of the state tax credits, which vary both in terms of the amount that they offer, as well as the length of the program. So in our case in New Jersey, it's now a 20 or I believe a 25-year program. So there's the federal credit, there's no maximum to the cost. So full 30% of the cost, the installation, et cetera, is a tax credit. Whereas the state incentives are based on the amount that's produced. And so you're getting an amount per kilowatt hour, megawatt hour. I read that some states exempt if there's an increased value on the property because of solar, they'll exempt that from property tax calculations. And then another key thing is just understanding how the production will actually be tracked, reported, and then these credits that you get, these SRECs, who is selling those, what they're charging for you. I went through hours of trying to sign up on these crazy websites, and turns out the provider had already selected one, and I had missed an email. And so just another thing to think about. But in conclusion, I found that I've been much more conscious of how much electricity we use. Obviously, I'm looking at, and that's the final slide, I'm looking at our production numbers, and it's been exciting. So in the middle here, you see by month. So as again, we're in New Jersey, as the amount of sun increases, it's gone up each month. On the left here is the actual meter outside, so it's kind of hard to see, but the top is the kilowatt hours that we've consumed from the grid since the meter was put in, which is when the system was put in. And then below the 5.1 megawatt hours is what we've given back to the grid, so credit on our bill. And up here, our peak amount at a time was 15 kilowatts, and then 115 kilowatt hours, I think, was our best day so far. And you can see, so there's an app in our case that's tracking this, and you can see real-time data. So this was last month. You see the variation based on sunlight and I guess angle of sun and various other factors. Yeah, that's my experience. Hopefully anybody seeing this will learn. There's a lot of things to look into, and definitely good to get some help. I wasn't able to chat during it, but I don't know if they're looking at questions.
Yeah, it's just really cool to see the kind of going from, somebody who's looking at things from the grid perspective to somebody who's looking at things from an installer perspective, and then to see it kind of all come down and filter down to somebody who's actually gone and put solar on their home to kind of extract the benefits of having that on their home, and what that process looked like for you, John. It's really cool to see, the different thoughts and different points of views and the processes that follow. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, this is a great time to kind of step forward and share your thoughts or share some questions. I know I'm very keen to explore how all this can kind of translate into something that can be used to power regenerative network states. Like, how do we get from, utility owned energy to community owned, network state owned energy that's decentralized and can power our use cases for it?
Yeah, one thought on that point is, people need to be educated. So sessions like this, resources, people who have the experience, explaining both the need for it, the benefit, of it, as well as, what's involved. I would have done it, anyway. Like I was committed to having solar panels. As I said, I wanted them in a previous house, but the financial aspect is, it was a big decision, major purchase, and has long-term ramifications. So
Yeah, very interesting. Chris asked a question about measurement. How is measuring done? Is there, is it like some kind of a smart meter? Can anybody access the data that's associated with it? Is it ownership only? Like the owner can only access it? Is it only the company that's provided the system to you can access it? What does that look like?
yeah, so as far as
Yeah, go ahead, John. You could start, and then I can share some deeper monitoring.
Yeah, in my case, so the last slide I had, the photos on the left were the actual meter, outside, and you can actually see it moving and see the numbers changing. And then on the right side of the screen was this app, Solar Edge, which is, I think that's the inverter, or it's the system. So yeah, I just log into that. I have it on my phone. As far as I know, only I can see that, other than that's the point about the reporting, and so claiming your state credits, the SRECs, is based on reporting of production. It goes into some system. Like I said, went down this rabbit hole and then found out that the provider had selected somebody for me. They were already doing it, and they just needed my checking account to send my my credits. But it was one of the confusing aspects for sure.
Yeah. Do you see I'm sharing my screen. Do you see?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is one of my customers, right? So this is a Solar Edge inverter with optimizers, the one that Chris mentioned. So this one also has the ability to isolate a panel that has more shade or is dirty, and then be able to maximize the overall power. So the monitoring John was talking about is more generic. Like, okay, you will see like how much you produce in June, in July, in August. But when you do it yourself, or you're a small company like myself, I give like my customers full access. And that of course creates a lot of problems, but I love problems, so who cares? For example, they might go into looking at each panel, how each panel is producing. And then if one panel is like 10% under, man, then it's the phone calls begin, right? And so for example, this system, I wish I could show, I don't have the satellite image, but the panels are shown in the way that they are actually installed. So on the left, you see they're darker. That's because right now it's still morning time, right? So on the west, it's still a little darker. And then but this system, I want to show you this system, because you look at the panels all over the place. This was a great learning experience. The lesson learned here with the monitoring, which was great, was to be able to balance the panels, to balance, like to have like more panels in one string that is facing east, and most panels in another string that is facing west. So you can maximize or actually minimize the scenario where it's too cloudy or rainy, and then like a few panels on one side or the other can create a very low voltage total, and then the inverter might underperform. So by seeing each panel and having a very technical customer, we just kept fine tuning this thing. I went after the install, I went there like 7 days, like in different times until we it's beautiful how much we were able to optimize the system. So you're able to monitor, and we can go deep, like in all the information here. Like we can go deep, daily, weekly, monthly. I could even download reports that show like every 15 minutes what's happening in amperage, in voltage, in power. It's incredible. It's just incredible. So, and then you could go deeper. Like I have another customer who has CTs on all their breakers. So then we could see like, what appliances are using more power, and then that leads to like kind of like your question or your comment, Ben. Like, okay, in network states off grid, like how do we like put certain appliances on solar, others maybe don't need to be on solar, or some batteries are connected to some sub panels of the house, and and so forth, right? It gets really complex, but that's the beauty of monitoring, that we can see like very granular detail of how a system produces. Like for example, if I have one customer that it's also a very complicated system, like the panels all over the place, and we saw like one panel was underproducing, and it just creates like a really it creates a easy way to see what's going on at all times, and then it makes it really easy for me to go and go to the manufacturer if there's a problem, and show the data like, hey, look, this panel is underperforming. And then I do a voltage test and I record that on a video, send it to the manufacturer, and they'll send a panel with no questions asked. So this one, I'm about to do that. There's one panel that is underperforming right there. You could see it very clearly. You see that? So yeah, that panel is been underperforming. All I need to do is just go there, disconnect it, put an ampemeter, and then it's going to show that in open voltage the panel underperforms. And these are dark up here because there's a lot of trees up here in the morning, but that's okay. That's just the way it is sometimes. Those panels are going to produce a lot of power in the afternoon.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't put it in the slides, but I did in the beginning get a projection of sunlight in the different areas of the roof, and they use that to design the system. But I'm really interested in the aspect of individual panels, performance, and sort of seeing that they're doing what they're supposed to. Which actually relates to a point I did have a bullet on it, but I think I missed saying it, which is pretty important. In my case, the provider guarantees the amount of production. So if the panels don't produce what they said they would, they have to actually make up the difference. And that was a key for me because I had no way to evaluate, is this correct? Are they doing it right? Is the right number of panels? Is it, et cetera. So I figured, okay, at least they're guaranteeing that amount. I know I'm going to get that. I can sort of base my calculations on that.
Yeah, and sometimes there's it's too much information, because for example, this panel, even though it looks like it's doing 64 watt hours right now versus the others are in the 400s, I mean, that's 1/26th. That's like 0. Something percent, right? Like of the total. And it's such a tiny thing that if one contractor had that issue and they didn't show the panel per panel thing, you would never know, because they will guarantee like 5% under that what it should produce. But when I do this with my customers, even the 0.1% difference, they'll want me to go and fix it. So that's why a lot of contractors don't share this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So is there an API for the inverter that can be used for third-party monitoring and reporting, or is there an output feed directly from the inverter that can go into, like, say, a smart home device?
Right. The inverters have their the equipment inside. Depending on and then you put a little antenna outside for cell service or Wi-Fi. But inside the monitoring is happening inside the inverter. The current transformers are inside.
Interesting.
But on the panel level, it's being sent by the optimizer. So not all inverters have that technology. And that, I don't know how it works. Maybe Steph knows, but like the hardware of how an optimizer or a microinverter sends the information to the inverter on a panel per panel, that is very technical. That electronic engineering right there.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I always wondered because there's another way to do this too with the Tesla power walls, or at least, battery packs that you're storing in home that interact with what was solar generated. And then something for, I mean, this is all proprietary from the Tesla side, but when a large storm was coming in, if the power wall for any reason was not at full capacity, it would start to charge um, to full capacity. So in case you lose power during the storm, you had that backup. So it is like, it doesn't answer your question about like an external API to be able to track your production, but um, one of the major inverter companies was SolarEdge that at least we had used and we recommended to companies to homeowners, and that's the PDF that I just put in the thing about in the chat about their APIs. One last thing I wanted to say about decentralization was for a long time, people question whether you can put a solar panel on top of your electric car and just drive it around and charge it up while you're going. And it's not that feasible for a few reasons. But another way to think about this is on something like the Cybertruck, which has some significant external um, uh, voltage outlets. It has two 120-volt outlets and one 240-volt outlet, which is capable of running some serious equipment. So let's say that there is your neighborhood has gone out, has lost power for 3 days. Somebody could drive, or you could drive several electric vehicles into this kind of looking out into the future, where you could drive it into the neighborhood and provide some of that on the ground small electrical needs, like powering a refrigerator or water pump to pump water out of a basement for any reason. So it's kind of directionally thinking decentralization. What happens when you have an energy grid on wheels? It's very small scale, but there's I can imagine some point where you do connect and have the ability to output a kind of significant amount of electrical power. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
it's
like
very
that.
interesting you bring up the situation of like a city being out of power, a neighborhood being out of power. I remember not long ago seeing a news article about a deployable um solar array that fits on the back of like almost like a semi trailer, but maybe a little bit smaller, and it just kind of rolls out and expands out to be this pretty massive thing that can be deployed at the ready for like disaster relief situations, hurricanes, things like that. Pretty cool. And just to double click a bit on the whole decentralized and like maybe power and regenerative network states, I'm really interested in the idea of these VPPs, these virtual power plants, and like how a organization or a network state could start to develop these, or an eco village could become its own VPP and then generating RECs. I know there's like certain states that have significant RPS goals that they'll pay, top dollar for those RECs, so that the utility companies can meet those demands of being at a certain percent of renewable for their power production. Curious if Steph, maybe you could expand a bit on your thoughts on that and maybe how that could be developed, or what you've seen maybe.
Well, I'll agree with John that the SRECs are one of the more confusing parts, but in New Jersey, at least over the past like 5 to 10 years, they had been so coveted because of the market price for when you produce a kilowatt hour, the equivalent SREC that you could sell for was like the profitable portion of the system, and it was like quick and fast, and so it's but um, for somebody like myself and probably Al, it was hard to promise those things to people. Like you didn't want to lead with, "Oh, this is going to make you so much money because here's the market price and it's producing this much, and over 10 years you can assume you're going to make this much money." It was like the wrong way to do the business. You didn't want to mislead people because those things could change and did change based on state policy. So incentivizing along the lines of like solar renewable energy credits, it theoretically makes sense. The tokenomics of it and the tracking of what you produce to who receives the benefit, is I think we need to see a lot of experiments happening. But when you get into such a regulated and utility focused thing like the energy grid and what you produce and how you distribute it, it gets very murky. So I do think that, John, do you have any battery backup?
No, and that's what I wanted to ask. So I've considered it. And basically my question is, we also don't have a generator, but we want to have something as a backup and power goes out, completely. So that we can at least run, refrigerators, some basic, doesn't have to be the whole house. And so my question is, is it, are people using batteries for that, purpose? Or is it better just, do the generator for that need, battery if you, need it and want it for, for other, so.
Yeah. The generator is, I think, a well-known solution. It's like it kicks on right when you need it. It's it's an alternative fuel source that you don't have to charge up yourself. So what batteries are definitely something that's used. Are they capable of handling large loads like kind of the gas generators might be? To some extent, they are. If you scale up, you get from Tesla's point of view, like 2 or 3 power walls, and that's significant financial output. So to make the economics work, I think it's a good question. And then, yeah, actually, I don't have a good answer there. Yeah, go ahead, Al.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think we're getting there. And you mentioned something earlier that I think that's what the future is going to be. What the Tesla truck is able to do, like it has outlets. So there's a lot of cars that are starting to do that, like the Ford 150, the Hyundai Ioniq. I imagine all the Teslas, and I'm sure a lot of German cars too. So basically, it's not just so we went from just solar panels and inverter to then a battery or a power wall to now the car as well. So the car battery, they're massive, right? So that's a very advanced technology in battery, in the battery industry, because a car is going to have what, like the equivalent of like 6 power walls. So that's a lot. And so I think that's the future. Vehicle to grid, V to G. And most people need a car, right? So I think that becomes part of the equation. You start designing the system, including your vehicle. And then as far as like generating RECs, it unfortunately, that's highly depending on the state that you are. And because the states will regulate things. And then the states sometimes have some kind of deal with the utilities, and then only the utility can buy that power from you, unless you have a private PPA. So I think what needs to be done is like more like, okay, now we just mentioned adding the car. I think we also have to add wind, and then we have to add geothermal, maybe a little bit of biofuel. you know, it just I think in a network states sense, everything needs to be integrated, just like nature. You know, I always fall back to that concept of like mimic nature. So yeah, I guess that's my take. Like nature has so many sources of everything, almost like infinite, right? Life is almost like infinite if you think of it. Life, not the resources on Earth, but life. If life just keeps growing, we could go to other planets too, and then get power from other planets, you know, from space, whatever. So, yeah.
Chris
That's
asked a
my
really
take on
good question. Just seeing it now. Has anyone ever played in the DIY battery space making batteries from life full 4 cells? I personally am not aware of anything, but maybe Steph or Al or John. Have you heard of this?
Sorry, what was the question again? The DIY battery?
Yeah, DIY battery, making batteries from life before cells.
From what cells?
It's life before.
Oh,
It's a
wow.
type of lithium. A few years ago, I was geeking out and I found that there's whole communities of people online who like they'll take cells, they'll order them from China. I'm not recommending this approach, by the way, but I'm just pointing out that there's a community there that does this. You can order cells, and then you can actually you can create batteries from these cells. And I think part of what's happened in that process as these communities have built is that the price of batteries obviously is coming down naturally because of cars and stuff. Anyway, electric cars. But I think there are people out there who basically make a DIY version of a Powerwall. Wondering if any of you guys have ever come across that. I'll share some links in the Discord.
Please do.
Yeah, just making head shaking saying no's, but it's definitely an interesting idea. I'm curious as to like what sort of like safety stuff one would need. Just knowing how lithium is.
That's the thing, right? Like with batteries, because each battery has a battery management system, and you can create your own battery management system, and you can buy kits online through some of these communities, and it can bring the cost right down. But I think from what I've seen, since I was looking into it, which was like actually more like 3 years ago now, in that time, it's about a quarter of the price to buy the batteries new than it was back then, and you can get a 12 I think 12 kilowatt system for like 5K. So like depending on where you go, that's delivered to the UK. But yeah, previously it would have been much, much more expensive than that. And do you install batteries as part of your installations, Al?
Al, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I've installed batteries. And it's just you need a little more electrician experience, because there's a lot of connections, but the instructions are pretty straightforward from the manufacturers. Like I can share a system design, and let me share my screen. So this is a battery I have not installed yet, but I can show you another one that I have installed. But this one I wanna play with this one because it's cheaper, and it's solar edge, but it's so easy. It's just like a plug and play. That's why I love it. So this is a permit set. Go to the there it is. So this is what it's called, the SLD, single line diagram. And so two inverters. This is a pretty big system. It's 20 kilowatts, a lot of panels, 50 panels. And then these inverters are 10 kilowatts each. And actually 7.6. And then these batteries, these two are the batteries, right? And they're also like 10 kilowatts each. And look at that, plug and play. That's all it is. The other batteries that I've installed are way more complicated. So this, and they're from SolarEdge, the company Steph mentioned, and the one that I just showed you the monitoring. So I totally trust that company. And look, it's just plug and play. However, you do need the inverter to be what is called an energy hub. So it needs to have like an kind of like the battery has either another inverter inside to convert from DC to AC, and then the inverter already has that, right, inside this inverter. Once again, I don't go too deep in the electronics, but like basically the battery comes in DC. So just like the panels go in DC, it also has another terminal for the batteries to also go in DC, and then everything's just like merged and converted to AC. Pretty simple. So it's easy. I can show you a little bit more information about that battery.
So something I am a bit curious about is, so I heard for a long time during my time at Jasmine Energy, the idea that decentralizing the energy grid, establishing more microgrids and self-reliant systems within communities was actually a benefit to even say the national security of the nation, for like the United States, for instance, who's always under constant threat of potential cyber attacks on the grid system. I'm curious to hear what you guys' thoughts are about that, and like, does that help build in some more resiliency and prevent larger widespread outages if like say the United States, for instance, were to really lean in on community solar and really develop residential solar even further than what they already have? Would that be, you know, a positive impact of that in terms of that side of things?
My guess is that it would make us, in the short term, more fragile, because just the distribution system with, you know, even in my local town in Lumberton, New Jersey, South Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, there were limitations being put on how many people could put solar panels on their homes because it would be too much potential load at certain times for the utility to manage it. And so in the short term, if one doesn't also have like the requisite battery storage, I would think that it would make the system a little more fragile, actually. It maybe in like highly densely populated areas, because if you think about it, when John's system overproduces for what he consumes, his electricity is going out onto the grid and going to its nearest neighbor that is drawing. And so it's not like it's going round trip back to the utility. It's staying local, which is cool, but it just makes those nuanced decisions on grid management tougher. So I do think there has to be that transition to a smarter energy grid. But like if you just said everyone put solar panels on the roof today, I think you would probably cause some like potentially catastrophic damage.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because I do recall an instance, I think it was last year, I believe it was Pennsylvania, had introduced significant amount of solar into their grid system. And they were overproducing, and then they actually had to disconnect them from the grid because of this very issue. And it really highlights the importance of building out and really creating a smarter grid system. And like, we really need to be investing in that infrastructure as well in order to be able to handle these sudden loads being generated during peak time for when solar generation is taking place.
Now,
Yeah.
if you were to say, if there was a really energy intensive computational process that created virtual currency that could switch on and off for when it takes its when there's too much load on the system and you fire up that computation and it's cheap to turn off at other times, you may have the right type of monetary outlet as a form, like as a kind of think or virtual battery that may help us balance a grid. I'm being
Yeah.
roundabout,
Yeah,
but
that's yeah. That brings up a good point, because last week we discovered that some of these companies were putting on people's residential systems what they're called basically a load dump. And what it is really is it's turns out that it's mostly Bitcoin mining. So when they have producing an excess amount, it goes into the Bitcoin mining, and it turns on, and it's then starts to mine Bitcoin. And we kind of discussed about how that could be an incentive to actually build out oversized systems for what you actually need. So that way you're having another source of revenue potentially through the Bitcoin mining operation that, maybe is in your garage or something. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, there's different ways to try and handle and offload excess energy that's trying to be put back on the grid. So seeing different unique ideas would be really cool. I think, like the Bitcoin mining thing's pretty cool. Something like what you're talking about is really
Yeah,
interesting as well.
that's wild. On a related point, to clarify what you were saying, Steph, in the chat, if the grid goes down, so does that mean if the power goes out, my panels have to shut off and I can't use them to generate some power? Oh man, I didn't know that.
this has been such a like yeah, it's essentially if the when I say the grid, I guess I'm saying something too large, but in your local town, if the power goes out, the grid goes down, but the sun is out shining and your solar panels are working, because they have to have an interconnection to the grid, it's uh, the circuitry is passed so that it's not isolated from the grid,
Okay.
and therefore it would it would make a potential safety hazard for those who are working on the grid if there were alternative sources putting a load on there. But and Al, I think, alluded to this, there's a more complex interconnection when you have batteries that it's the process doesn't immediately go out. I can't remember now. I'm dated, but it would go through the battery system before going out to the grid. And if the grid was down, it would stay within your local system so that there wasn't any outlet onto the grid.
Yes.
Someone fact check me, because it's been 5 years and I
Yeah,
can't remember exactly.
it is like that. It goes, so if you have a battery, then yeah, the power goes to the battery first before it goes to the grid, and it stays there. And then the battery has a mechanism to basically, shut down with, with the disconnect, the source that goes to the grid. So then it shuts down what it's called the grid output, and it keeps the mini grid, the microgrid on. So you have two outputs, one that goes to the grid and then one that goes to the microgrid. And the microgrid is the house. So speaking of communities, and I don't think too many people are doing this, like we could like design a whole community that has like this shared thing where, like, let's say, 5 out of 20 homes have batteries, then those 5 batteries can power like minimal loads in the 20 houses, right?
But you would have to use like you would have to have your own wires interconnecting those 20 homes. You wouldn't be allowed to use the utility wires.
Right. You would have to, create interconnections between those homes. But in a more modern, utility, that there should be a way to do that, right? There should be a way that you can sort of like have that option to have more resilience inside a neighborhood.
So
And I think that goes to what you were saying about having those virtual computations. Like, if there's too much power on the grid at a certain time, then, based on neighborhoods, and I think that's in the direction they're going, at least here in California, then they know, like, according to area, where there's shortages of energy, where there's too much energy. So if there's a shortage, then the virtual power plants go on, and there's those load dumps that Ben mentioned, and then whoever has those batteries gets paid extra, right? Because it's emergency power. But if there's too much power, then the energy is just going to dissipate. So that's why here in California they're starting to, and this happening in Germany already. That was a learning experience where there were days that the price of energy was negative, because there was too much energy, right, on the grid. So the energy was being lost. So when that happens, then you maybe you need like utility scale batteries if the home batteries are not enough. So in California, they're already scrutinizing that, like, okay, based on how beneficial going solar is right now, like the only way that it's really beneficial is by putting a battery. So that's how they're kind of like measuring. I mean, they're very smart. I mean, I cannot imagine how many calculations, because it's also like a market study, like economical study, like how many people are going solar right now? What is that growth trend?
Right. Who will respond to what incentives? How much will they respond, et cetera?
Yeah, but if everyone in one neighborhood buys solar at once and they don't put battery, then there's a problem. I mean, not a big problem, but then energy is going to be wasted. Basically, it's not sustainable. So that's why they have a good case, even though it kind of like crashed the solar industry in California. It makes sense, right? Like we do, like, yeah, we need battery, otherwise we're wasting energy at 2 p.m., 3 p.m.
So is it plausible then that we could actually, through a smart grid system, through a series of interconnected microgrid systems, ever reach a point where we actually do achieve true energy abundance, and where energy is essentially becomes a point of being dirt cheap? I mean, granted, this is probably not in the best interest of major utility companies. They would probably not be on board for this. They would probably fight this to some extent tooth and nail. But in terms of the perspective of humanity itself, right? One of the greatest achievements in human history is harnessing electricity. It's I believe one of the things that is transformative to individuals. Having access to consistent energy is massively. We heard from the other guy. I forget. Now I'm spacing on his name. Last week, who is in Africa, talking about all these individuals who are literally in the dark, and we take for granted the ability to turn on a switch off and on behind us. So how do we actually achieve true energy abundance in a way that makes it possible?
Right. Or in 50 years, 100 years, what is the system and grid going to look like? It clearly was designed, when none of this was possible. And sounds like from what you guys are saying, we're kind of retrofitting certain things on. Some things work better than others. There's challenges. I've read about California having to deliver power to Nevada, for free, because it has to go somewhere and offload. So glad they're smart people are you guys all thinking about, what could it look like? How do we get there? And maybe there's a role for, VDAO and some of that, and whether it's a product or certainly there is an education, I think, right? Having these discussions, but maybe potentially doing some experiments that help accelerate that evolution or revolution.
Absolutely. Al, I think you're trying to talk. You're on mute, buddy.
I think it's kind of like the gas stations, how the gas stations work. Like gas stations, or even a Starbucks, like they choose locations, right? Because they're strategic. So if and I think I had this conversation with Chris, like what if, because there's so many gas stations that are going out of business already because of so many electric cars. So what if we start converting all those brownfields into mixed-use buildings that are virtual power plants, and they're like strategically located. So it's natural to think that the grid is going to evolve in a way that it's smart, like you're saying, Ben. It is smart, so it's going to know that by area, because solar has to be very geographical, right? And even power transmission, it's more efficient when it's local. So yeah, just like you picked the right location for a gas station or a Starbucks, we should pick the right locations for mixed-use buildings that are virtual power plants. And then there's abundance of power at any time. And if that power is not needed, then it's mining Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really yeah, I really like that thought. I mean, it makes total sense when you think about it. And it's like, to John's point, these systems were created and designed when none of this was even possible. And now we look at it and we're like, well, duh, this just makes total sense. Why aren't we doing this? We need to be doing it now. And maybe that's a place where VDAO can step in and start experimenting and kind of working on developing these types of solutions. At the risk of sounding maybe a tad bit ignorant, maybe you could expand a bit, Steph, on why it is that when a local grid goes down, why is it that I can't put power on for, say, my neighbor to grab off of that same grid that they're connected to? I'm curious. This is something I'm not familiar with, so I'd love to kind of hear you expand about that.
I think it's pretty simple, actually, and I don't have the exact details. I think Al might know better, but it is a safety issue, that when grid goes down, people are going to go work on it to bring it back up for everyone. If there are people working on the line, they need to know that it is safe to interact with, and therefore, if you are dumping excess current onto the system, that is going to proliferate. It's unsafe for those workers, and therefore it's required to shut down.
Yeah, that's
it's
exactly
required that it doesn't go back out of your local microgrid, your local system.
Yeah, and in a way, they're relying on the automatic shutdown devices to work. So they're basically AC disconnects that you have to install by law.
So would it make sense to kind of maybe mimic the gas industry, the natural gas industry, in how they distribute natural gas, to where it's more localized to the neighborhood, where so it's like you do have like an area that goes down and they need to go work on it, instead of having to shut off a wider area, they're basically like in gas, they pinch off the main and then they go in there and they work on it, and it significantly limits the amount of outages that take place, allowing other people in the area to still maintain their services. Maybe that's something that the energy industry could take an example from or learn from, maybe to start implementing.
Yeah, and it's funny because the more we talk about how that solution would work, the more central we start thinking more about being centralized again, because we have to rely so much on the grid for all those things to work. So I think there should definitely be a easier way to develop like private grids.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, this has been absolutely amazing. This continues to be a very interesting topic within the community. I know we're all very, very heavily been leaning into solar and renewable energy and decentralized energy. Um, maybe we could start leaning into some other areas of decentralized systems like water systems and some other things in the near future. But energy really does seem to be like a driving force behind, what it is that we're doing. I mean, being that we're blockchain oriented, Web3 oriented, it just ties in really nicely. You got to have energy where you are in order to, well, do things like what we're doing right now, for instance. So I really appreciate you all coming in and sharing your thoughts and sharing your experiences. It's been, again, extremely informative and insightful. So really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I
Loved
learned a
it.
lot. Wish I had had this 18 months ago. Took me a lot of time and probably money and frustration for sure.
Hey, John, you're gonna be able to share that, and we're gonna work together in helping
Yeah,
hundreds, thousands to
yeah,
do it better and better.
yeah. No, exactly. I was happy to do it. But yeah, thanks, and we'll definitely talk more.
John, I'm
Awesome.
super jealous. I've been wanting to get a system myself for a long time. So,
Oh,
I'm just waiting until I can get a house to get a system. So I'm jealous, man. I think
yeah,
it's fun.
community solar is a really interesting idea, right? I'm gonna look more into that.
Let's
Yeah,
do it.
I've been really curious about like I've always had this idea for well, maybe I shouldn't say always. For the last couple of years, I've had this idea of developing a relatively sizable community garden in that at that community garden implementing community solar that can go and be distributed out to like the neighborhoods around it. And yeah, there's a lot of things that can be done and a lot of experimentation to take place here. So very, very keen to move forward with these things.
Cool. All right.
See you
Thanks,
guys.
guys. See you soon.
See y'all. Bye.
Thank you all. Great seeing you.